Thank you, Nancy, and thank everybody for coming. And I'm sure a lot of you stayed up late to see the end of the baseball game last night, so there might be some bleary eyes here, but it was worth it. And I also wanted to just acknowledge Nancy and what an influential scholar she's been for my work on reentry. She's quite a big name in her own right, so I didn't want that to go past without saying. So this is work that I'm going to be presenting on a recent book that I published. My two colleagues I want to acknowledge are David Harding at University of California, Berkeley, and Jessica Wise at Portland State. Thank you, Nancy. And here's a picture of the book that Nancy was just holding up. And I want to start, and I'm going to talk a little bit quickly because there's a lot to cover, and I'm trying to give you some of the highlights from this book. But one of the things that's distinctive about our approach in this book was we try to tell a lot of stories about the way that people are experiencing the reentry process, and I can't do justice to that in a talk without trying to channel individuals. But it's basically two types of research. On the one hand, we did some quantitative statistical research. We had a great partnership with the Department of Corrections. They really gave us access to a lot of data from their administrative records. What we did was we collected records on everybody who was released from prison in a single year in 2003. And we followed them over time by linking them up with other administrative systems. We also had a team of research assistants go into the Department of Corrections and read the case notes that parole agents wrote about on a third of these. People couldn't do it on all 11,000, but about 3,500 people. And from those case notes, we were able to extract a lot of other information that wasn't otherwise in their databases, especially information on where people were living and who they were living with. And then we did qualitative interviews with a small sample. It started out as 24, ended up as 22, 2/3 men, 1/3 women. We followed them over a long period of time, 3 to 4 years, in some cases longer, but 3 to 4 years on everybody. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, first of all, I'm going to kind of pick up where Sam left off, talk about what happens after people are released from prison, the process of returning home. And I'm going to I should have put the word home in quotation marks because I want to problematize that word. Maybe in a lot of cases there isn't a home to return to. And then I'm going to transition to talk about this tremendous amount of instability that people face, both in terms of where they're living, their residence, and their economic situation. And then say a little bit about how people do or do not find work after prison and the challenges of maintaining that work, and then conclude with some thoughts about policy too. High-level thoughts. So returning home. Here's a quote from one of our study subjects, Randall, a 32-year-old African-American. In prison, I can't disappoint anyone. Out there, I can. And sadly, that's true. There's a lot of stress. I mean, it's a tremendously stressful process. And this series of graphs illustrates how rampant the possibilities to, quote, recidivate are. And there's multiple pathways or multiple ways of capturing that process. On the upper left, you see cumulative rates of arrest of people who were released in 2003, and by 7 or 8 years out, it's almost 3/4 of the sample had experienced at least one arrest. That's how to read that number. Felony conviction, it's about half after 7 or 8 years. And then a lot of people also abscond from parole, which is a violation. And then you see other things on the bottom, the fraction of people who return to prison. And one thing I want to point out, because I'll come back to it in a second, is in the bottom left you see the fraction of people who return to prison for any reason after they were released in 2003. And then the bottom right are the people who were returning not for a new felony conviction, but for a technical violation of their parole. And that's what we call the revolving door, because it's the primary way through which people who were imprisoned make it back into prison. I'm going to have more to say about that in just a second. Oh, here it is. I forgot that it was next. So at the end of the slides, there's a list of articles, and this is one of them. And one of the things that we found using a design that was very similar to the one that Sam just described, with data on all people who were convicted of felonies in Michigan, is that if you net out the effects of incapacitation, if you set it, I mean, we find, as Sam did, that for the time that people are in prison, they're incapacitated, they're not committing crimes. I mean, it's still possible, but not very, very rare. But if you net that out, there's really no significant increase or decrease in the difference in the likelihood that somebody's going to be return to prison. In fact, there's there's actually a slight likelihood that people who were in prison are going to be going back to prison, more likely than if they hadn't been imprisoned originally. And that's due to the prevalence of, you have to not only comply with the law, but all the regulations of your parole. And to give you a little bit more sense of what those are, here's some of the most common reasons for parole violations. They can include relatively minor things like failure to report to parole officers, fail to attend or complete the programming. Now, in fairness, it's not always the case that just doing one of these things alone is going to land you back in prison. Oftentimes, there's some discretion that parole officers have about when they return people, and oftentimes it takes like 2 or 3 of these violations. But there's still a lot of surveillance and potential for failure to comply with that surveillance, and it's going to come into play when I talk about residential and economic instability in a second. Okay, so I mentioned that the word home was somewhat problematic, and one of the myths that we have, and that we had going into this research, is that that the high rates of recidivism are because people are getting back into the situations that they were in before they were in prison. And literally the same situations, that they're returning home to the same families, same friends, same neighborhoods that they were living in before. And by collecting all this information on addresses, we actually realized this was not so true. It is true that they're ending up in neighborhoods that are pretty risky places to try to recover and rehabilitate, but they're not actually returning to the same neighborhoods. So this graph, the very top, shows you the blue bar are people, or the location of the first place that somebody moved after prison, and then the red bar is like any address that they had within the first 2 years after prison. And they tell the same story, that up at the top, like less than a third, the blue bar, of people coming out of prison are going back to within a half mile of where they lived before. If you look over the first 2 years, it's still less than half are returning to within a half mile. And if you look at the bottom set of bars, a lot of people are moving more than 5 miles away from where they were before. So there really is a deliberate attempt being made on the part of people who are returning to try to distance themselves from home. Unfortunately, that doesn't always translate into a more supportive environment, as I will say more about in a second. Let me just go back to this over here. And the reasons why are, intentionally trying to avoid the old neighborhood, but also because sometimes families move away. And they experience high rates of having a loved one incarcerated can be very disruptive for the family, and so where they were living before the loved one went to prison may not be where they're living afterwards. And then also institutionalized housing is another big reason why people don't always go back. And here's a quote from one of our subjects, Lenora, who said, "I messed up before going to wet places and wet faces." This became kind of a mantra for us, this phrase, in thinking about neighborhoods. Wet places and wet faces. As soon as you go around there and they drink and somebody's smoking crack and they're using heroin and they ask you for some money, then if they don't know where I'm staying, that's how it's going to be. I'm not going to let nobody know where I live but my kids and my family. So what you see here is both a deliberate strategy of trying to avoid those same temptations that were there before, but also like a disengagement from the neighborhood, an isolation of sorts that can have negative repercussions in the long run if you think about reintegration as really trying to, reintegrate back into society. To kind of stay clean, some people are having to withdraw and cut off ties. Okay, so the next topic is residential and economic instability. The first fact up in bold there is that it really jumped out to us is that the average parolee in Michigan, based on the data that we collected, moves more than 2.5 times per year. So that's a tremendous amount of mobility for any population. And those moves cover an average of 25.5 miles between residences per year. So they're jumping around a lot. A lot of it is going back and forth from institutionalized to private housing. And about a quarter of those moves are being triggered by what we call intermediate sanctions. And that is a sanction that's, it could be a so-called custodial sanction. It means you're leaving home, but you're not going back to a state prison. You're going to a local jail or a detention center, a correctional center, or a treatment program. But these sanctions, although they they're intermediate in the sense that they try to divert people away from going back to prison. They still cause a tremendous amount of disruption and generate a lot of residential instability. Accompanying that residential instability goes hand in hand is a lot of economic instability. And what you see up here is we came up with our own kind of subjective typology of the way that we characterize these 22 men and women as we follow them through time. What kind of a situation were they in at any given point in time? And the lowest rung on this ladder is what we call a state of desperation, where they didn't have any security whatsoever, no secure housing, scraping for food, and at risk of going back to prison at any moment. A step up from that would be survival. You're able to get by, maybe you have some source of income, but you don't have secure sources of housing and food still, and you don't know where you're going to be living or eating the next night. Then states 3 and 4 are the more successful states. Stability, where you have a more secure source of shelter and food. You have certainty of meeting your needs for the foreseeable future, but not necessarily long term, and you don't have prospects for upward mobility. And then finally, number 4, independence, where you do have like you're on a career path, and you have some long-term prospects. Very few people reach that last stage of independence. And then the 5th one is when you're back in custody. So it's kind of orthogonal to all this. You're back in prison. You're not out in the community suffering this problem. And this is a chart that just visually, there's a lot here, but tries to show you how much bouncing around to different categories there is when we track these 22 men and women over time. And I think this is showing you the first 3 years of tracking. The red indicates that they're back in prison. The dark blue is the people who achieve that state of independence. And you see how few dark blue bars there are. Very few people were able to really gain a stable foothold in the economy. And there's a lot of slippage. Some people make it to a state of stability and then they bounce back. So it's just I don't want to go through this in detail. I'm just putting it up there to show you that it's a tenuous grasp on stability usually. While it's up there, I just want to say that the key thing that distinguishes the people who are able to get more stable than not is support from family. And I'm going to come back and say more about that. Another thing that we talk about in the book, that I don't have time to go into detail about today, but I wanted to just make sure to mention, is the legal financial obligations, the fines and fees that people have to pay, that often account to up to like 30 to 60% of the income, if you're lucky enough to have income coming out of prison. And there's a lot of people doing in-depth work on, other scholars doing in-depth work on this right now. It's become a much bigger issue than it was when we first started this research. People are understanding it more. Most of the study participants that we studied were either not paying these fines and fees or having their family, or relying on their family members to do so. It just was too much of an obligation. And of course, the debt can contribute to future adverse consequences down the road, erosion of credit scores, making it harder and harder to find a foothold in society. This is what I was alluding to a second ago about the role of families. And I also wanted to acknowledge there's also a lot of other interesting research that's come out in the last few years about the role of families. And I would say one of the key points of consensus that's emerging is that families are particularly important for providing material or so-called instrumental support. That is putting food on the table, a roof above your head, getting transportation, and in some cases also helping find jobs for people through contacts. And that families are bearing the burden of these costs of reintegration. And unfortunately, that's falling disproportionately on families with the fewest resources to be able to provide. So it's really a burden. There's also a negative side that comes out in stress and conflict, and born out of those same circumstances that people with loved ones incarcerated don't have the resources necessarily to house them and help them when they come back. And this is also a theme in the current research that I want to say first about emotional support. I left that out. Emotional support is also important, and especially it's important when people face what we call spoiled identities. Like that is the way that they think of themselves, what their identity is was kind of erased by their felony, by their incarceration. They don't want that to define the rest of their lives. Re-engaging with family and becoming a supportive son or father or cousin can really help you rebuild a pro-social identity and give you a sense of purpose. On the other hand, as we all probably know, families have conflict and stress, and sometimes, and a lot of the people that we studied coming out of prison had people in ill health that had to give care back to other people in the family, and this created a lot of stress. And there were some situations where there was also coercion to get back into a life of drugs or crime. And this was especially true for women coming out of prison whose husbands were criminally active or partners. So here's a quote from one of these women. My husband, it's kind of like we hold each other up or we pull each other down together. So there's two sides of the same coin, but families are critically important locus for what happens after prison. And this is the last thing about families. These are people's living arrangements when they leave prison. So the green box at the top shows you the most common private residences that people have. So about a third of people are going to move in with their parents. You also have people moving in with a spouse or partner, or with a close friend or another family member. In the middle there, this says alone, and there's no box around that. It's just worth pointing out that unlike what may happen in the movies or TV sometimes, nobody leaves and goes living on their own right after prison. Like 6% of the people did that. You're either living with family or you're in an institutionalized setting. And I could show you more data that I don't have right now, but that over time, this is not just this is right after prison, but the same picture is true for like 2 or 3 years after prison. Okay, so finding work. First point, since I'm running out of time, I'm going to go quickly. Employment rates are extremely low across the board for people coming out of prison. This is another busy graph, but what we have here are different modal trajectories of work. And the red area, is the proportion of people employed, the blue is the proportion of people unemployed, and the white they're like people who are incarcerated. So we divided we used an analysis that kind of found these 6 categories of people. And what you see is like 45% were in this low employment category. Most of them didn't work at all for the entire, I think this was a 3-year analysis, or 4 years, 3 or 4 years. They were not employed at all. 45, or if they were, it was only sporadically for a few quarters out of that time period. So that was the most common. The next most common was reincarceration, that you see there's a little bit of employment right after prison, in part because they're participating in reentry programs, and then that drops off, and a lot of these people go back to prison. And then the third most common, but only 17%, were the people who found steady employment after prison. So that trajectory was only less than a fifth of all people that were released were able to find that kind of stability. And even there, you see some drop off over time in the employment rates, which is disturbing. I'm going to skip over the types of jobs, and I think I'm going to cut to let me just have this quote, and then I'll come to the next point. So Randall says, they don't want me working at no car wash. I can't work at no bar. I think that's against parole guidelines. You can't get paid under the table, basically. They want to see a check stub for verification of a job. There's got to be a check stub. So the point is that the conditions of supervision, they can help keep people on track, but when the surveillance piece is overemphasized, and when parole agents have the ability to also, first of all, to demand to see a check stub, but to check in with employers and remind the employers that the person working for them was incarcerated, that can really doom these people to failure. And so kind of the overactive nature of parole surveillance can be a problem. Okay, so, but in conclusion, I want to start off by just asking the question, so what do we mean by reintegration? And we often talk of, a word that gets used a lot is reentry, and the point that I'm trying to make here is that reintegration is not simply like avoiding recidivism, and reentry is about a lot more than recidivism. It's about integrating back into society and gaining a stable foothold in the economy, and rebuilding your social networks. And we write about, in the book, there being like these 4 different key social contexts that determine the success or failure of the reintegration process. the neighborhoods that you move into, which are important not just for the temptations of drugs and crime, but also proximity to jobs is a big factor. So where you live matters. The family that you have around you, I pointed out how important it was for the material resources that they provide, and also how there can be, how it imposes very large burdens on families to do so. The labor market, which I didn't have a chance to say too much about, but work is very hard to find, and when jobs are available, they're typically in the secondary labor market, and there's irregular hours, unstable jobs, and they can be very hard to maintain work. And then the criminal justice system, and primarily the context of community supervision, and how the idea of these intermediate sanctions, although they do keep people out of prison, can also be very disruptive and cause a lot of residential mobility and economic instability. On the flip side, we also saw that, ironically, and this is not an endorsement of prison as a policy or incarceration as a policy, but that there is a lot of potential for positive change. That people, when we talked to them in this study, when they were first coming out of prison, were tremendously optimistic about their chances for success and avoiding all the failures. And there's a lot of evidence of cognitive transformation that's gone on, that when people have been sitting around thinking about what they've done, and also drying out often. Unfortunately, that gets totally overshadowed by all the obstacles that they face. But it's important, I think, just to point out that there is a possibility for positive transformation here that I think as a society we should be focusing on. And that leads me to policy, and I don't have time to go into these in great detail, but one piece of it, which under the heading of justice reinvestment, is kind of a lot of what Sam was talking about reducing incarceration rates, saving the money that you would get, and putting it back into social services. That's the notion of justice reinvestment. A second one is a point that I've hit on already about making parole more supportive rather than punitive, moving away from like the law enforcement model of parole more towards a social work model of parole. We are helping people get the resources that they need. More time in prison to prepare for a release is critical. Like there's a lot of, one of the most common complaints that I hear from people in prison, I teach classes in prison, is just that they're not getting enough programming early on in their sentences. They're sitting around for a long time, and that it would really help them in their efforts to rehabilitate themselves to get that earlier on and more often. And then policies that would help people rebuild their identities, and I'm happy to talk through some of these in the Q&A, and support families do the work of reintegration. Last thing I want to say in closing, I can come back to these policy issues, but this is an article on the Hill where we fleshed out some of these ideas a little bit more. Is I wanted to just talk about give a nod to a colleague of mine who's doing a project that I'm involved in about how difficult it is to do this research, especially with state administrative records, because the nature of criminal justice data in this country is that they're very siloed. Even within states, across different agencies, and definitely across states. It's really hard to put this together and do the kind of work that Sam was talking about and the kind of statistics that I was showing you today. And this point has been made by a few reports at the National Academy of Sciences, which are those icons up there. And my colleague Mike Mueller-Smith at Michigan and my other colleague Keith Finlay at the U.S. Census have recently started this project called the Criminal Justice Administrative Record Systems, funded in part through the National Science Foundation, to help overcome this problem. And it's a really heroic effort to try to take as much state administrative data as they can get their hands on through data use agreements with individual states and through getting what's available publicly on the web, and using the best techniques for linking data to put the records together and making them available to researchers. So happy to talk more about that. I just want to acknowledge my federal funding too. Thank you very much.
Two really excellent and provocative presentations. I know you're all dying to ask questions, but I think it's my prerogative to ask the first two, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Bear with me. So Sam, very rigorous analysis. The overall finding is that incarceration is not cost beneficial, yes. I would argue that it's even less cost beneficial than you said for two reasons. One is, I don't think your models included the cost of the crimes that happen behind bars, correct?
They would if they ended up in the courts.
Yeah, I can assure you they don't.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just think it's important to know, like, incarceration doesn't necessarily mean that crime goes away. There's a lot of horrible things that happen behind bars. There are victimizations that occur that often don't come to the light of day, aren't counted, but still have costs. They have cost to the system, cost to the individual, and cost to society. And then my second question / comment is around this, for me, rather troubling finding that incarceration of a parent benefits the child, and I'm sure you've encountered, some strong reactions to that. My reactions have to do with what I know about the literature about impact on behavior, educational impact, psychological impacts. There's a lot there to unpack. I'm guessing that you were unable to put a price tag on those types of impacts. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So we think that there's big psychological impacts of parental incarceration, and this is kind of another thing that is fully outside what we can put numbers on.
Mm-hmm. But if you were able to quantify it and include it, it would mean that incarceration was even less cost beneficial.
I think that's probably right. I mean, I don't think it's right that every child is facing psychological harm when their parent is incarcerated. Often they're going to live in a more stable environment, typically with grandparents or with the non-criminally involved parent. And so for those children, I think that it is likely to be even a psychological benefit. If we add it all up, though, yeah, I think it's likely that you would end up with another net negative.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Thank you. All right, Jeff, on to you. I loved your research and your findings. In part, maybe it's narcissistic because so much of what you found mirrors what we found many years ago with our own longitudinal study of reentry, particularly around the residential mobility and the both good and bad reasons why people moved, right? And like some people moved because they intentionally didn't want to go back on the same street corner with the same negative influences, right? But that also meant that they were moving further away, potentially, from their families and that family support. Some people moved away from their original neighborhoods because their families were forced out because they couldn't afford to stay there because their family member was incarcerated and they were a main breadwinner, right? There's a lot to unpack here that I think has policy implications. I'd love to hear your response to that, and also we found some distinct differences in degree and level and type of family support for men returning home from prison versus women. I'm wondering if you found similar themes.
Great question. I think you had more ability in your study to disentangle the effects on men or women. We had a very small sample. I think I would say that one thing I guess I touched on a little bit was that women do face I think when they're part of a couple, they often face that threat of coercion a lot more than men do. That they're with guys who are bad influences on them. I don't know what the gender differences. I'd like to hear more about your gender differences. But more generally, I'd like to unpack that whole. What do we make out of all this? I think that one thing is. That paradox that I pointed out about withdrawing from the community as a strategy of intentional social isolation can be beneficial in the short run maybe, but damaging in the long run. I think that since we're on Capitol Hill and thinking about federal roles in this, I think that supports for families who are shouldering that burden of reintegration are a mechanism that we should all be thinking about more. As we know, people coming out of prison are ineligible for a lot of benefits. But we should be thinking of ways of trying to help the families who are really trying to provide that housing and that food and everything else, and through federal benefits. So that's the beginnings of an answer.
Yeah. So our study found that men were more likely to have all manner of family support. Nearly all the men had a woman in their lives, right?
Yeah.
It might be an aunt, a mother, a grandmother, an intimate partner. They always had someone, right?
Yeah.
The women who came out, largely, if they had family support, they were relying on their adult children for it. I think that probably holds true with your research.
Yeah, that even with our small sample, but same dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Great. I will not hog the podium anymore. I'm sure many of you have questions. Who's first? Don't make a liar of you. Oh, yes.
How you doing, sir? My name is Dominic. I know this is probably a touchy subject, or touchy thing to say or talk about, but you mentioned that the mass incarceration happened in terms of the 1960s, and it grew. Do you think that, because the bottom line is this, and it hurts me, African-American, especially African-American men, are more incarcerated than their Caucasian inmates. So do you think that the harsh treatment that African-Americans went through during the Civil Rights Movement, like Dr. King going to jail or anybody going to jail, do you think that that's part of the reason why there was a decline, must not a decline, but an increase in mass incarceration? I'm not asking you to be political now, but I'm just saying, do you think it's possible?
No, I mean, I think it's clear that criminal justice policy in the U.S. is very racialized, and it's not possible to separate those things out, right? Like, I'm not an expert on it, but we know from recent history, for example, that crack cocaine was penalized at 100 times the rate of regular cocaine, and that there's a clear racial angle there. And so I think it would be silly to say that there was no racial angle at anything that happened before that.
Put another way, the criminal justice system is an extension of our history of slavery and lynching and Jim Crow. That's my history. Others?
Let's spend some time both in New Hampshire and then conversely in Louisiana, which I'm not sure if this relates to y'all's studies, but they're very opposite sides of the spectrum in regards to public education systems. New Hampshire and the Northeast states generally having higher rated public education versus Louisiana and some of those deep southern states having lower levels of that. Could you talk on the cost of that? Because that would be a preemptive strike time to that deal. Can educate the population better? Could you increase that cost? Or conversely, coming back from incarceration, how could you relate public education to a policy that might help reintegration?
Yeah, I can say, okay. So I would say, so I can't speak to these differences across different states, based on the quality of the school systems there. But I think that education is a very key component here in thinking about, first of all, who ends up in prison, but then also what their chances are after getting out. And one of the policy levers that we really write about and endorse is like trying to get more access to higher education, especially for people in prison, which I think is really critical. And it's critical, so there's several reasons that it's important. And one of them, as a professor and other people here on the panel who are professors, we like to think it's all about all the wisdom that we impart to people. It's not all about that. I mean, there's also the more symbolic aspect of having put yourself, having made the sacrifice and had the determination to go and get a degree, and what that signals to employers, for example, about your, what kind of potential employee you would be. And I have some colleagues who write about this idea of signaling theory in economics, about like how education is one means that people have to send the signal that they would be a strong employee. But people coming out of prison are kind of denied that opportunity a lot. And one of the interesting, what's somewhat disappointing as a finding is that job training programs, when you look at randomized control trials, don't have a lot of impact on chances of finding work and having a high income after prison. On the other hand, a lot of people who go through job training programs get placed in work, and they have very high placement rates, and they look successful. It's just when you look at them through the lens of a randomized control trial, they appear to be unsuccessful. So to make sense out of those two findings, it could be the idea that what's happening is that people who would be more likely to find work to begin with are going into those job training programs, and they're providing people the opportunity to send that signal, and they are getting hired because they set aside some income that they could have had more immediately, maybe because they put themselves through this training program, and this was their credential coming out that sent a signal to employers that I really am committed to changing myself and to being a good employee. So I think that having more opportunities to send signals like that to employers is a really important thing.
Yeah, and let me follow up on that. There's also just this question of timing that kind of disappointingly doing job training for people that are just getting out of prison doesn't really work. But we do know that investing in education earlier on tends to have higher returns. And so my colleague Jim Heckman at UChicago has done a lot of work on programs in the 60s and 70s that provided very intense structured support for low-income families. So this is the Perry preschool program, most famously. And what we see is that the kids that got those supports ended up committing fewer crimes in the future. And so I think that kind of pushing back when we're doing the educational investments can increase the benefits.
And I would just add another angle to it, which is that one hypothesis is that some of these job training programs aren't working because they're only looking at one piece in the puzzle, right? Everyone's like, oh, we just have to get them a job and it'll be okay, not recognizing that they might have long and serious histories with substance use disorders and other issues that make it very hard to find and keep a job. So, you know, in some of the literature that we've looked at, my conclusion is that you really need to take both a holistic approach to supporting people in reentry, but also a tailored one that responds to their unique needs and also assets. I'm going to take one more question, and then we're going to have to close.
Thank you. I'm just wondering what you think those who are mentally ill who get incarcerated, should they be incarcerated or put in a hospital? I ask this because 46% of those in the federal prison system are mentally ill, and do you think it'd be more beneficial for them to go to a hospital versus being incarcerated?
So I haven't done any specific research on this, but I can just tell you that, I mean, I'm aware this is a big issue. Mental illness also goes, unfortunately, hand in hand with substance use a lot, and that was something that, I mean, we knew going into our study that substance use was going to be an issue. We didn't know how big of an issue it was. On the other hand, mental illness is not necessarily very correlated with like the likelihood of committing a violent crime after prison. So, but there are people who are mentally ill. But yeah, the conditions of incarceration are just awful, and spending time in solitary, especially if you have mental illness going in, can be just life damaging. So I would. Yeah, I think that the more that we can divert people from prison, the better off most people will be, especially for mentally ill.
Okay, well, we're done, right? Is this time up? Okay. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience. I think the speakers are willing to stay.